Okay, I think I've just made this work. Has been challenging for me. I'm not familiar with YouTube live streaming. I thought I could just screen share like I do with my lecturing software, but apparently not. So I wanted to talk today about the Popular Olympics, and people can just ask questions in the chat. I can see how many viewers there are. I can't see anything in the chat yet, but I'm sure I'll be able to. The Popular Olympics are a super interesting event that never really gets talked about in the more like corporate media, I guess. By the way, I am broadcasting from a wardrobe in my mother's house because it's the only place that has Wi-Fi. So it's just me and the wine collection. I feel like could have made this more fancy, but I've spent all afternoon fixing the Wi-Fi to get this far. Okay, let's talk about the Popular Olympics. They arise obviously as this like boycott of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. You should be able to see. Yeah, it's going to zoom in here. So the 1936 Berlin Olympics are given to Berlin when it's not a Nazi, when it's not a Nazi country, right? I think there's this kind of idea that the IOC gave the Olympics to Nazi Berlin, which it didn't. The IOC gave the Olympics to Berlin in 1931, and actually met in Barcelona to discuss that they were going to give where they were going to give the Olympics to. Right, the IOC meets and it votes on venues. You'll be familiar with that from like the more recent sort of venue debates, right? When LA and Paris and all these countries were trying to get to be the host of the Olympics, the IOC had to vote on that. I guess I'm just behind this now. This is actually one of the voting slips. The vote's really interesting. So the vote happened a week after Spain went from being a monarchy to a republic. And Spain at the time had a ton of, a lot of political unrest, right? It was very clear that the dictadura, the time before the republic, was coming to an end. And something new was going to happen. It wasn't clear if the military were going to take over in 1931. It wasn't clear if it was there was a strong anarchist movement, certainly in Catalonia. They obviously had aspirations to set up an anarchist system as well. What ended up happening, right, is that all these people who are members of the IOC turn up in Barcelona, a city which has just celebrated its independence, actually, very briefly when when Catalonia declared independence, when Spain declared the Second Republic, Catalonia declared independence within Spain. That didn't last very long, right? Catalonia eventually comes back into Spain. But when the IOC arrive, remember that the International Olympic Committee, like all sports, is run by rich people for rich people. And in the 1930s, rich people were counts. They were nobles, right? So turning up in a revolutionary city which has just declared its independence is not a good vibe for them. And as a result, they freak out. And those who are there tend to vote for Berlin. But unfortunately, lots of them just don't come because they're afraid. They're afraid of getting lynched or whatever rich people get afraid of. I'm not sure. So most of the votes are conducted by telegram, and there's a persistent rumor that the vote was fixed, right? That Weimar Germany was seen as a much more preferable alternative to revolutionary Barcelona, and so it was fixed in favor of Germany. I can't prove that. I've spent months of my life looking at these little blue strips. Rich people have shit writing. But it's very hard to prove that these were fixed, right? But that's certainly a persistent rumor. So what happens next is that the Olympics are given to Berlin, and a number of people don't want to go to Berlin, right? So Berlin, by 1933, is pretty obviously fascist. It's pretty obviously anti-Semitic. It's pretty obviously anti-leftist. It's pretty obviously racist. What that means is that black people, the Jewish people, the leftist people don't want to go to Berlin, right? Because they're worried that they won't come back, and because they want to stand in solidarity with people like them who are being oppressed. Or in some cases, they just want to stand in solidarity with people who are being oppressed, even they're not like them, right? Which shouldn't be a revolutionary concept. So you get this growing boycott movement. The boycott movement's global, but it really takes root in the United States. And it becomes kind of a conflict between Avery Brundage and someone else called Jeremiah Mahoney, right? Brundage is interesting because Brundage starts out this period as the United States delegate to the IOC. Later, he becomes chair of the International Olympic Committee, right? I don't think he starts as an anti-Semite. I think that's too simple of an explanation. He becomes an anti-Semite. He's definitely an anti-Semite by the end of this. Why is he an anti-Semite by the end of this? Because the Jewish people and the communist people and the NAACP, right, leftist Jewish people, black people, they get together and they say, hey, actually, fascism is shit. Let's not go. And so they form this really interesting alliance. It's boycott movement. And Mahoney, of course, becomes convinced that like this is some Zionist organized or Jewish organized conspiracy. And he goes to Germany to be like, oh, how bad really is Nazism? He doesn't speak German. So he just gets given like a regime fixer who takes him around. He's like, it's wonderful, actually. He comes back, he says, it's wonderful. He says, with the, your strings are being pulled by the Jews, kind of, he doesn't say that, but that's what he means, right? And the United States ends up going to the 1936 Olympics, right? And with the failure of the boycott movement to win in the United States, so it dies everywhere else, right? You can read the British Cabinet Papers if you really want to, and look at them discussing if they're going to go or not. They're like, Nazism's quite bad. Oh, the Americans are going. The Americans really were. The Americans owned the Olympics. After the 1932 Los Angeles Games, the Olympics were an American event. And you can look for decades afterwards. It's an attempt from other world powers to take the Olympics away from the Americans. Did they ever really? Not really, maybe now. But the Olympics were very much an American event. So they decided to go. All the other countries decided to go, right? No one's going to boycott the Olympics. But this dude, Leon Blum, you can see like one of these people is not a nice person. So Leon Blum's a guy in the hat. He's elected Prime Minister of France in early 1936, right, with part of a Popular Front government. So Popular Front, it is a Comintern policy, but the Popular Front is an alliance of socialists, communists, liberals, sometimes anarchists, leftists, sometimes even like anti-fascist in the broader sense of the word, conservatives, right? So Leon Blum comes to power in this broad coalition, the only real unifying point of which is fascism equals bad. And also, like, we are French, we don't want to be invaded by Germany again. So Blum comes to power and he hosts a conference, the International Conference to Respect the Olympic Ideal, in April of 1936. And people who have been involved in these boycott movements from all around the world come to this conference, right? They're like, what are we going to do? It's kind of funny that they called it the Olympic Ideal because the Olympic Ideal was pretty questionable at that point. Like the Olympics said one thing and did another thing, like they do now. They were like, they held them up to what they claimed, right? Which is a good thing to do. But they claimed the Olympic spirit lay with the anti-fascists, not with the fascists. But they didn't have anywhere to like unite this boycott movement. The problem with just not going is that no one cares, right? No one cares if you don't go to the Olympics. They're just going to be concerned with the people who do go. So they needed a place to be, to host their alternative. That is where Barcelona comes in, right? Barcelona had bid for the 1931 Olympics, so it already had the stadia. It also had an existing popular sport infrastructure that was really cool. The ERC, which has been in government in Barcelona since 1931, was another broad coalition. It wasn't quite as broad as the Popular Front, but it used sport to bring working class and middle class people together behind its ideal of like cross-class, progressive Catalan nationalism. And they really were quite progressive for the period. So the Catalan delegates say, look, we'll host it. We've already got everything we need. It'll be cool. So that's in April, right? And they're going to put the events on in July. Now, as you'll see, the events actually were supposed to start on 22nd July to the 26th. And then the response was so great. We'll explain how the response was so great in a second. But they had to extend them. So often when you see this poster, you'll see it with this, which was just pasted on when it was on the street. This is the updated poster, right? So 19th to 26th of July, 1936 is when they're going to host these games. Here's another poster. So what's cool about these posters and what's cool about the Popular Olympics is that there was an explicit effort made to include women. There was an explicit effort made to include people of colour, which you don't see. Like if you look at a Berlin Olympic poster, you don't see that, right? I don't have one here. I thought I had one here. But you won't see in a Berlin Olympic poster anyone who isn't white or male, right? But Catalan popular sport, right? You had the Feminist and Sports Club in Barcelona, which was feminist first and sporting second. And popular sport made an effort to include people of all races, genders, ethnicities, etc. And so when you see in these letters, they're reaching out to the committee that organised the Popular Olympics reached out to the organisers of labour movements, of political movements, of movements for rights of people of colour all around the world, and said, hey, we're having this event. We would love for you to come. And when they reach out to the Communist Party in the USA, when they reach out to workers' sports organizations in the USA, they say, look, we want to feature black people from the United States because we understand that our struggle against fascism and your struggle against racism are the same thing. And so we want you here, which was not obviously the same message that was coming from Berlin, right? So this poster is cool. See, we can see people of different races, different sexes, different genders. And they're all sort of walk into the Popular Olympics. The other thing you're going to see is you're not seeing a Spanish flag. You're not seeing a Spanish flag because A, this was a Catalan event, and B, people didn't compete as nation states, right? They competed as self-identified nations. So the exiled Jews of Europe competed. The anti-fascists exiled from Germany competed. You don't want to really fly the German flag, right, when Germany's full of Nazis who have tried to kill you and your friends. Women students of the world, all these different kind of conglomerations came together and competed as nations, not as states, right? And which I think is cool. Here's the US team. Some of the US teams, there's only 5 of them. But these are the guys who boarded ships in New York. Nearly everyone who came from the United States came from New York, actually, on the East Coast at least. And that was just because they were really struggling for money. You can see it writing about it in another book. You can see in their correspondence how even a few weeks before, they're telegramming the Catalans and being like, you guys pay for this and we'll pay for this. Can you guys maybe hook us up with a boat? Have you got any connections? So they end up sending 10 people. This is some of them, right? This is Dot Tucker. She was the only black woman that I've been able to find who competed. She was a sprinter, a member of the International Ladies Garment Worker Union. I believe these all are ILGWU members. They certainly sent the most people. This is Al Chaikin, who I've got a chapter on in my new book. Super interesting guy, community college professor, which is rad. Former professional wrestler, I guess, but elite level wrestler. He nearly went to the Olympics for wrestling. But he's kind of old by this point. He was teaching at CUNY, City University in New York. But when he heard about these games, he decided that this was for him, right? And he was going to come as a coach and he was going to come as a competitor. There is never a dude who has more obviously made a career fighting than Al Chaikin. His nose is just like a pancake. So to fund these games, they needed funding for transport, right? Because these working class people didn't have the money to get themselves over there. They weren't social elites like Olympians tended to be in the 1930s, right? You either had independent money or you were backed by a nation state to get to the normal Olympics, the IOC Olympics. These folks had neither. So the Catalan government goes to Leon Blum and says, hey, you're aligned with us. Can you help? And this is extremely unusual, right? Normally the Olympics are the center of nation state, kind of George Orwell talked about being war without the shooting, right? Which is what the Olympics are and have become, and certainly were throughout the Cold War, right? And they are now, again, we shouldn't kid ourselves. So to ask another nation state to pay is kind of funny, but they did, right? So the French coughed over money, Madrid spent money, the Catalan government spent money, the Barcelona government, City Hall spent money, and the Swiss spent money, right? So this is super unusual, an Olympics funded by a bunch of different people because they just think that Hitler is shit. And you can see these posters that came out, you can kind of see by the typesetting how rudimentary this was. And even a week before the games, they were rushing around with these little forms, and these little forms had boxes, and they were going to people's houses and saying, do you have a bed? Do you have a place where someone can wash and shower? Will you feed someone? Okay, you've ticked all 3. Will you house an athlete? We'll pay you. And so these people were going to, some of them stayed in the Olympic Hotel, but many of them would have just stayed amongst the population. This is the stadium, right? Stade Olympique Louis Companys. It wasn't called that then, it was just called the Olympic Stadium. It was named after Louis Companys, who was the president of Catalonia at the time. He was shot here by Franco's dictatorship, right? We'll learn a little more about him in a sec. But it was named after him afterwards, hosted the 1992 games. It's on top of Montjuic. Montjuic means it's like the Jewish neighborhood, the Jewish hill, where Jewish people used to live outside of the city, right? Which is appropriate because they made every effort to reach out to exiled Jewish people, up to and including the theme music for the games. The lyrics are written by an exiled German Jewish poet, and they had, right? These are the three meals, right? Sort of lunch, dinner, and morning coffee. Right? You can actually find the menus. It was funny, they always had a vegetarian or vegan option, which I thought was cool too. So they even had issued press cards, right? These are tickets, and one of them is a ticket. So they were very much ready to go. Some of their events were fascinating too. So some of the events that would be happening in the stadium, like a 10 by 100 meter relay. Why do they have this kind of bizarre school sports day activity? It's because the goal of the popular sport, is to make the working class healthier. It's not to celebrate the achievements of one elite athlete, right? Like when we think about the Olympics now, we always think about the unique individuals, right? Usain Bolt has always been the guy we've looked at for the last few Olympic cycles, right? This one guy who has an incredible talent. But what that hides away is that maybe it can be hard for other people in Jamaica, right? Not everyone is able to be healthy. At the time, the biggest sort of concern for a lot of unions, a lot of working class groups, a big concern that they had was tuberculosis. So they were concerned with tuberculosis. They, look at that, my video thing's just quit. I'll open it up really quickly when we keep talking. So tuberculosis was like really rampant in working class communities, and that they wanted to have an event which said like lots of people are healthy in your country, right? Lots of them are able to run quickly. So that's why they had the 10 by 100 meter relay. The idea was that it would just it would celebrate countries with like a healthy working class that had hopefully not been impacted by tuberculosis too much. I think it was kind of cool. They also had like a big mass swimming relays, and the deal there was that like a lot of people didn't teach children, certainly girls, to swim, and Catalonia was really big on teaching girls to swim as part of its popular sport infrastructure. So they were having these swimming races, and a big swimming race that was mixed gender, that allowed countries that had like done the right thing, or nations that had done the right thing, taught young girls to swim, to prosper. So I thought that's a kind of cool, fun, like different twist on the Olympics, which normally celebrate individual achievement, right? So they're getting ready for the opening ceremony on the 19th of July, right? And that evening, Pau Casal, if you're not aware, is like the father of modern cello, right? He's the guy who invents the modern way that we hear and play the cello. He's conducting an orchestra, and they're going to play this song, right, composed by a Catalan composer with words by a German Jewish exiled poet, that Hans Eisler is the guy's name, that symbolizes everything the popular Olympics is about. They're getting stuck in, they're playing it. Then they're going to play Ode to Joy, right, Beethoven. Someone comes in, bam, 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 you guys have got to stop, it's been a coup. And everyone knew there was going to be a coup. They didn't know it was going to be that day, but the tensions had been mounting, right? The coup had actually started the day before. It was very clear that the government, which had been elected in Spain in 1936, which was also a Popular Front government, was not going to be very popular with the military, and the military weren't going to have it, right? So Pablo Casal is sitting there, and he looks at his friends, and he says, we should probably finish playing our music, because this is the last time we will see each other for some time. And it's true, lots of them die. Lots of them die in the next 24 hours, right? So they sit there, and they're playing the Ode to Joy. They're playing this, here he is, right? Legend. They're playing this sort of really kind of sad but happy music, and at the same time in the streets outside you're beginning to hear people throwing up barricades, right? Now, this is one of my favorite pictures of the 19th of July, because you can see barricades here, and these are the Popular Olympics posters that I showed you before. So it's pretty cool to see how concurrent these events were. So what happens on the 19th of July is that the Spanish military decide that democracy is not for them, right? That winning the game is more important than the rules of the game, is how I like to say it. So they decide they're going to have an uprising all across Spain. The generals are going to take over. And in Barcelona, that means marching from the barracks past the stadium into town. And so that's what they do, right? They They're coming into town just around dawn, and all these athletes are sleeping, right? They're struggling to sleep. It's their first events tomorrow. And they're woken up at 5 a.m. by gunfire, right? They don't know what the fuck's going on. No one does, right? All the Spanish people have been aware of it, but they'd heard rumors, but, these were people who were they talked about anti-fascism a lot in the US, right? But the US wasn't really in danger of a coup at that point. Spain was. It kind of was, I guess, but less so than Spain, should we say. So what they do is they look outside and they see barricades like this, right? They see hundreds of working class people, thousands with guns, right? Because the anarchists had armed themselves. Now, across Spain, the civil governors, the government refused to arm the working people. In Barcelona, they'd armed themselves, and then Companys was able to arm some of them. And so they've got guns, right? They're able to fight back. And in places where the anarchists had armed themselves, the coup failed. In places where they weren't armed, the coup succeeded, right? It's as simple as that. It's whether or not the government trusts the people as to whether or not the government survives in that area. And there are all these amazing stories of that day, right? Where, contrary to what we do now, I guess, which is log on to Twitter and post #resist when something bad happens, they were not taking it. And I guess, for instance, in one instance, some anarchists, right, members of the CNT, were fighting against an artillery battery, or a small horse-drawn artillery piece, and they come up surrendering. They put their rifles down, their hands up, they walk up, they talk to the artillery soldiers for a few minutes. They persuade them that the working class shouldn't be fighting the working class should be fighting the people who ruled them, and these guys turn their cannon and their artillery piece around and start firing at their officers, which is a pretty special thing. It's a very rare instance of that solidarity being shown and working, right? So now our athletes are still wondering what the hell's going on, right? And gradually, as the shooting dies down, they go out. And when they go out, they see that people are throwing up barricades. And you can see when you look at their diaries, right, that they're fascinated by the fact that there are women at these barricades, that there are women with rifles, there are women leading attacks, commanding these small squads of anarchists. And this seems so alien to so many Americans, but it's important to note that it's not alien to Catalan people, at least in part because women have been participating in sport alongside men for half a decade at this point in the Popular Front, right? And a lot longer in politics, in anarchist politics, right? Anarchist politics, for a lot of the it's not always perfect, military in the town, and they loot thousands of rifles, right? They hand these rifles out to working people, and the city belongs to them, right? They woke up ready for a sporting event, and they went to bed that night, if they went to bed that night at all, with the city in the hands of the people, right? With no cops, with no rulers, with no particular laws, nor anyone to enforce them. And instead, they enforced their own laws, right? They made their own rules, they ran their own city. And this is an amazing period at the start of this. They call it the Catalan Revolution, right? That happened concurrently with the Civil War, because the anarchists really held power for a while. Now this changes, right, with the Soviet Union arriving. I'll maybe do another thing on that when I have a bit more time. But the Soviet Union arrive, they perpetuate their tanky shit. They do not allow the anarchists to do anarchist stuff. They remove women from the military through militarization. The Republic would have probably lost without them because they needed aircraft and arms, and they couldn't get aircraft and arms from anyone else. So it's entirely understandable why they were forced into this alliance. But when the Popular Army lost its popular character, then it stopped being a revolution, just started being a war. And for a lot of the anarchists, it was the case that they lost either way. If the communists win, they're going to get killed. Many of them did get killed, right? And many, many more anarchists were killed by the military police than fascists. But for the moment, things are looking pretty rosy, right? So the next day, the 20th, the athletes wake up again. And they have to decide what to do. They think, oh wow, we've dealt with the coup, right? Let's just wait a couple of days, clean up, and do the games again. But then it becomes clear that the coup hasn't been dealt with everywhere because the government hasn't armed the people everywhere. And so as a result, there's very clearly going to be a civil war. Now, for some of the athletes, they don't want to get involved, right? And they march through town, singing the Internationale in all their languages. For some reason, the British team had bagpipers, so the bagpipers playing the Internationale are leading them through town. And they go home on this steamship called Ibiza, and they leave for Paris, right? Paris had provided free transport to all the popular Olympics and all the fans, and then went to Paris and then went home from there, right? The French train unions guaranteed them free passage as a way of showing solidarity with the popular games and then with the Popular Front after the Olympics. So lots of them leave, but around 200 of them, as best I can gather, don't want to leave, right? And for many of them, that's because they don't have a choice. Many German, Italian anti-fascists were in exile in Spain. And the reason they were in exile was because the Spanish Second Republic had relatively liberal asylum policies, and obviously in Germany already they'd been killed. So they knew that the only way to defeat fascism was fighting. They had to fight first in Spain and then at home. But others decided to stay because it was the right thing to do. Some of them went home and then realized that the right thing to do was to stay and came back. One of them is this guy called Al Chaikin, the guy I spoke about, the community college professor, right? He goes home, he speaks at fundraisers, and then he realizes that he's not doing enough. He feels like he's not doing enough. So he comes back to join the International Brigade, right? Becomes a commissar in the Mackenzie Papineau, not a commissar, he becomes a quartermaster in the Mackenzie Papineau battalion, dies in 1938 in Spain, right? This guy in 1936 didn't speak Spanish, had never been to Spain. His family were from Russia. His family were Jewish, right? They'd fled pogroms in Russia. They'd reached a safe place in the United States, and he turned around, looked back at Europe, and saw more anti-Semitic violence, right? And he wanted to stop that. So off he goes to Spain, learns the language, makes friends, and ultimately dies at the end of the Second Republic, right? As do nearly all of the 200 volunteers, nearly all of the popular Olympians who joined the militia, and it wasn't the International Brigade at that point, right? They were called Centuria, groups of 100 people. So the British ones were named Tom Mann. The Italians had the Garibaldi Centuria. There were certain Centurias which were like Machnovites, so, from Eastern Europe, right? And they had the skull flag and such. But these were very much loose militias. They weren't organized communist international brigades yet. And these militias mostly from Catalonia go first to Zaragoza and then to Madrid. When they go, they kind of screw up the way they go. They're obsessed with like fighting for land rather than fighting for cities, and they're not very good at fighting. Right? These guys have been street brawling for decades, but they're not very good at fighting in open country. So that's how many of them die, with the exception of Durruti's column, which is very focused and is very successful in going first to Zaragoza, then to Madrid. Durruti, by the way, is this famous anarchist leader. Remember the FI? You can read Abel Paz's book about Durruti, it's excellent. So by the end of July 1936, Spain's in civil war. 200 of these people who had never intended to be home by August are now fighting and will die in Spain, right? And for these other people who came, they've seen what it looks like when working class people are able to defend themselves against the state, right? And are able to sort of stand up for what democracy and what bureaucracy really means. And they carry that message back home, right? Many of them go on to become labor organizers, to join the IWW. Some of them go on to become communists. Many of them go on to be extremely, I don't know how to say it, like disenchanted with Soviet communism after they see what it does to anarchism in Spain, right? But it's this incredible event that never really happened, right? There was not a race run. There was not a medal awarded. Nobody ever competed in the Popular Olympics. As far as I know, there's one popular Olympian still alive, one person who would have competed. He was training the day before, just in the interest of his privacy, because he doesn't like talking about it. I won't say his name, but he lives in Canada now. And his role there was to interpret for Esperanto speakers, right? Another thing they were big into was Esperanto, and the whole working class can speak this language. We just teach them. So it was this amazing moment of class unity, right, where you saw people from around the world didn't understand each other, who couldn't speak the same language, pitching in at these barricades. They didn't have enough rifles, so they would share rifles, or one person would load, or one person would fire. And they didn't really have enough of anything apart from this solidarity, which was enough, right, for them. And that's ultimately why they were successful. It's ultimately why so many people decided to stay, right? For all these young leftists who came there, they'd never seen a place were the working class. George Orwell said the working class were in the saddle in Barcelona, right? And so it's this unique event that unfortunately we never talk about. A couple of narratives about it that I want to dismiss really quickly, and then I'll see if anyone has questions. A couple of narratives I want to dismiss. It's not a Workers' Olympics. Workers' Olympics were held by the socialists and the communists. This was explicitly Popular Front in that it definitely included anarchists. And it was very different to the Communist Workers' Olympics, which were put on in 1932 and 1931, I think, and again in 1937. It was not a doctrinaire communist event. You'll see that all the time in like books written by people who are more qualified than me to speak about Spanish history in general, but have overlooked this because sports aren't important to them, right? Or maybe working people aren't important to them. Depends which book you read. But yeah, it's not a Workers' Olympics. It's often called a Workers' Olympics. It's not a Workers' Olympics, and you will see that a lot. There's also like a rumor that no one actually came to the Popular Olympics. That's simply not true. Muriel Rukeyser, who was a poet, is an excellent writer, has written a novel, Savage Coast, about her experience. If you want to see what it was like on the ground that day, it's a really, really wonderful novel. It was only recently printed. It was in her personal archive for a long time. So I recommend looking up Savage Coast. But people did come, right? And we can trace them with documents. That's what my next book will be, looking at what happened to them in the wars in their wars in the Civil War, right? What happened to them before they died in Madrid. Okay, so that is the 1936 Popular Olympics. That could have been a more clip presentation, but I'm not good at this and I'm trying to get better. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I've also posted a link if you wanted to see the pictures. It's in the press. I'm also going to record this partially for other people here, partially so I can use it for my students. I think I've only sworn once or twice. I think it's also really important when we look at this to look at like what can we learn from it. I think what we can learn from it is that like even progressive governments tend not to trust people, and that maybe they should, right? That the only places where the coup failed were the places where the people were armed, and that's not coincidence. I'm not saying you have to go out and buy a fucking gun. Probably shouldn't. But I'm saying that the government doesn't trust people even when it's elected by the people, and maybe it should. Also that sports are important, I think. Like sometimes, and it doesn't mean the Olympics are important or that like Tom Brady is important, but sports show us their way of demonstrating who we are, right? Where we tell stories to each other about who we are and who we think we are and how we fit together and who they are, who the enemy or who the opposition are, right? And for these young people who came to do anti-fascism, they stayed to really do it, right? They weren't just playing. Lots of them were prepared to die. On that day, thousands of them were prepared to die, right? There were thousands of athletes in the streets, unarmed, fighting a professional army with stones. But they succeeded, right, because of their commitment. And I think that's really important. Like sometimes we think about sports as just this thing that like old white guys watch while they drink Bud Light, right? But like sports are for everyone and can be for everyone. Obviously, if you know me, you know I'm about that. And I think we sometimes miss that with the increasing commercialization of sports today. But we don't have to, right? The sports can always be for you. You don't have to pay anyone. You don't have to take part in anyone's stupid certified contest or whatever. It's if you race bikes, you probably shouldn't pay USA Cycling, right? They suck. And I think that it's really important to realize that the function of sports are to bring us together or to divide us, right? But we can choose how we use that, and it doesn't just belong to any one sort of corporation or person. So I think that's super important. Yeah, like I said, my next book will be looking at the stories of these guys like Al Chaikin, where he grew up, what he did as a child, and then how he ended up in Spain. His wife is super interesting, Jenny Berman. They didn't take each other's names, but Jenny, which I think is cool. My partner doesn't have my name either. Jenny Berman did the world's first art therapy program for children in war. She came with Chaikin, and she set up a program where children drew pictures of their experiences, and you can see the kids who were at Guernica, what did they draw, what did they feel they see, right? Those pictures are actually at the UCSD archive. You can look them up online. The exhibition is called They Still Draw Pictures, And I think it's really worth looking up because it's an interesting insight into this beginning to realize that war leaves us with lasting scars. And the war impacts kids, right? The war doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It happens in places where kids would normally be playing football or running around. They're not. They're hiding from bombs. So her stuff's really worth checking out. They still draw pictures. It's at UCSD. You can also find it on the Abraham Lincoln Brigade's website. And yeah, I'll check in. I will write about in my next book. If you're interested in my existing book, you can search my name. I'm playing There's a World Worth Watching. It's very dull and academic, and if you can't afford it, that's fine. I'll send you a copy. I hope no one's watching this who's concerned about that. But yeah, I'll send you a Word document copy or something, or you can actually get it from your library as well. It should be free in all your university and local libraries. If it's not, you can email me. But yeah, my next book will be much more accessible, hopefully, and much more fun and much less dorky and footnotey. So we'll talk more about that. These stories in there, right? Specifically about the stories of these 200 people who came and stayed, right? Another thing I think that maybe could be dispelled so that this was a European event. It wasn't just a European event, right? You had these 10 American people. You had people from North Africa. You potentially had some people from Asia. I'm finding that really hard to pin down because anybody of Asian extraction from anywhere gets noted down as Chinese. But you definitely had people coming from mainland China to fight in the international brigades. So this is not something that China was not aware of, that people in China were not aware of. So yeah, it's not just a European thing. It certainly tries very hard. It's not just to be a white people thing. The reason they funded the US team coming over is because it was very important to them to link the struggle of black people in the United States with that of Jewish people and anti-fascist people in Europe. That was extremely important. That's why you see Oliver Law commanding the International Brigade, the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, right? You see a black man commanding white troops, which you don't see in the United States for decades afterwards. It's also why the US Army in World War II was not anti-fascist, right? If you have an army that is segregated, there were some integrated units, but the army is mostly segregated along lines of race, with the implicit assumption that black people are worth less. And that is not how anti-fascism works. That is not what Spain was doing. And there's no excuse about it being like a thing of its era, because before the Second World War, in the Spanish Civil War, black officers commanded white troops in Spain. It was entirely possible. And then they came home and they were forced to eat at different tables and sleep in different hotels from the people who they'd been commanding in some cases, right? It's a pretty sad story. Many of them weren't allowed to serve in the capacity they best could have served in the Second World War, even though many of them were experts in things like fighting, like German blitzkrieg, right? Because the Germans sent a lot of soldiers and the Italians sent a lot more soldiers to Spain, right? They could have been very helpful, but instead they weren't allowed to because racism. So racism hurts everyone, as we should all be aware, right? If anyone has any questions, I don't know if the chat is working, but you could also DM me on Twitter, I suppose, and I'll be happy to answer those. Most of this stuff, if you're interested in, I'm just looking to see if anyone's DM me on Twitter. Most of the stuff, if you're interested in learning more, I did put a little list on my Patreon, and it's open to everyone. It's not, you don't have to pay for it. You shouldn't have to pay to learn stuff. So that's on there. I'd recommend Muriel Rutgers's book. I think it's really good. And in Barcelona, they occasionally have really cool exhibitions. If you're ever there, feel free to hit me up and I'll tell you where to go. My friend Nick Lloyd is also doing a talk about a virtual tour of Barcelona tomorrow, which will be excellent. Nick's stuff is always excellent, and he really does a wonderful job of explaining the civil war in place. If you're going to Barcelona, let him know you are coming, book a tour, but he's doing a virtual tour tomorrow. You can find him on Twitter. You can find him if you type in Spanish Civil War tours. Nick Lloyd, you'll find him. He's in Barcelona, but he's doing a virtual tour, so you can watch it on Zoom. That's very cool. I would suggest that everyone who is available checks that out tomorrow. You can see what that stadium looks like now. There's a plaque in that stadium to Luis Companys. So Companys ends up remaining in charge-ish, not really, but sort of titularly, in order to negotiate with Moscow and Madrid. And eventually he's captured and he's shot right outside the stadium that has his name, outside the stadium that would have held the Popular Olympics. So it's kind of a sad ending for him, but he's very much a Catalan hero. He'd actually, in his earlier days as a lawyer, he defended a lot of anarchists, so the anarchists were pretty down with him, and as liberal politicians go, he's about as good as they come. So he ends up dying right in front of the stadium that is named for him. It's quite a sad story. And the Popular Olympics never happened, right? In 2016, 80 years after the Popular Olympics were supposed to happen, they held the opening ceremony. They finished playing Pau Casal's Ode to Joy piece. They finished playing the anthem. People came from all around Europe to celebrate what it could have been, but they've never really held the events. We never got to see the mass relay. I always think it'd be really funny to watch like the wrestlers taking part in a sprint relay. So we never got to see that. Maybe one day we will. Maybe someone will hold a giant Olympic boycott event. Suddenly these Olympics seem to be a shit show, and we're going towards giving all the Olympics to dictators now. So maybe at some time in the future we'll do this again. Certainly something that the world could do with, right? Like working class sport. And there still exist, of course, like sort of anti-fascist sports clubs all around Europe and the US. But this is really the peak of anti-fascism in sport, of explicitly anti-fascist sport. So yeah, hit me up if you'd like to read more. Apparently I'm not seeing the chat. If I'm not seeing the chat, can you DM me if you have a question? I'm responding. I'm responding on Twitter. Sorry, Chris has said I'm not seeing the chat. If you have a question, shoot me a direct message on Twitter. I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to talk more about all these people. Obviously, I've spent like 10 years studying most of these people, so I can tell you exactly what happens every 5 minutes on the 19th of July. Chris is going to message me back and tell me if there are any questions. Sorry, this is hilariously unprofessional. I'm literally in a wardrobe. Okay, there aren't no questions. So I will log off with a recommendation. Let me link to my Patreon post with the stuff I've said. I've also done a slightly more sort of clipped podcast with my friend Foster. Foster runs the Historias podcast, which is about Spanish history and Catalan history. If you're into that kind of thing, he's worth checking out. And I've done a podcast with him where we suggest some more stuff, suggest some more readings, go into a bit more depth about like the Second Republic beforehand. I would encourage you to read Casanova's book on the Second Republic. If you're interested in the Second Republic beforehand, maybe skip some of the other books which paint the Second Republic as like interminably fucked from the start, and sort of look at it backwards. I think Casanova's is good, and Casanova has a good perspective on what we would call the libertarian left, right? Americans refuse to use libertarian left because libertarian has been hijacked by the chuds, but for the rest of the world, libertarian left is anarchist, right? Libertarian generally is anarchist, right? The term was invented to get around censorship of the word anarchist. I'd recommend Abel Paz's book on Durruti as well, if you're interested. And Murray Bookchin has written some good stuff too. Never failed to plug Murray Bookchin, right? But yeah, his stuff's well worth checking out. And then if you read Catalan, Xavi Pujals has written amazing stuff about sport in the Second Republic. And it's very cool and very fun and very much worth reading. So yeah, I hope that was enjoyable. I'm sorry that this was so cobbled together. I have been handling livestock all day. I'm exhausted. But yeah, I hope this was enjoyable. If you do have questions, email me. You can do james.media@protonmail.com as well. I can talk about this shit all night, but I won't because I know that will bore people. But anyway, yeah, please buy my next book. That one will actually make me money. This one does not, sadly, as much as I shill it. I shill it because I care about this shit, and I think you should care about this shit too. And I think that people don't understand what anti-fascism is. For the most part, it is treating other people with decency and respect and opposing anyone who would not treat people with dignity and respect, stopping them by any means necessary. It is not... if you click on my book on Amazon, it also suggests one that says Antifa, Satan's henchman. which is a cool thing to be actually in a great band name if you're interested in starting a band, but also utter bullshit. So I probably recommend against that. All right, I'm going to end this stream unless someone's DM'd me any questions. No. All right, happy days. I'm going to start drinking. Have a nice morning. Bye-bye.